Everything began like a typical morning. Until it wasn't. A black woman walked into the federal courthouse, calm and composed, eyes sharp, completely unaware that she was about to become a target. Demeaned by the very people sworn to uphold justice. They looked at her like she was a nobody. They insulted her, violated her body, and laughed with smug satisfaction, as if it were all just business as usual. But they were wrong. They had picked the wrong woman. She wasn't just any citizen. She was Celeste Monroe, a federal judge, the only person in that entire building with the authority to use the law to tear the whole system down if necessary. And then a storm of justice began to brew. Filthy secrets came to light, masks were stripped away, and a stunning courtroom twist left the entire hall in stunned silence. Do you believe one woman can take down an entire power structure on her own? Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Let's talk. Just after 8 a.m., Celeste stepped out of her silver Buick. Morning light filtered through the drooping Spanish moss in front of the Charleston Federal Courthouse. She adjusted the collar of her deep navy blazer, stood tall, and gripped a slim brown leather file folder, unassuming but radiating quiet authority. The soft click of her heels tapped gently against the concrete. Each step a silent declaration, I am here. I am a citizen, but also the one with power. She never wore her judge's robe outside the courtroom, a personal rule that allowed her to see the world as an ordinary citizen. But that morning, no one greeted her as a judge. They didn't even recognize her. To them, she was just another unfamiliar black woman walking into a place that had never been welcoming to people like her. At the security checkpoint, the air shifted noticeably as she approached. Hank Riker, a stone-faced officer with a rigid old-school mindset, stared at her like she didn't belong in his world. Ignoring her ID, tossing aside any professionalism, he stepped forward, arms crossed, gloved hand raised. Ma'am, step out of line. Celeste paused, her gaze calm. Is there a problem, officer? Riker didn't respond right away. He inspected her from her neatly pinned silver hair to her impeccable outfit, to the unwavering steadiness in her eyes. Something about her unsettled him, a feeling he couldn't explain. All he knew was that he had to assert who was really in charge here. No badge visible. Can't let anyone in looking like that, he muttered. Celeste quietly pulled her federal ID from inside her blazer, its metallic sheen catching the overhead light. But Riker didn't bother to look. He snatched it from her hand like it was worthless, then stuffed it into his pocket. She raised an eyebrow slightly. I'm requesting that you return my ID. He stepped closer, his tone dripping with mockery. What's the rush, sweetheart? The words hit the air like a slap. A young female security officer standing by the baggage scanner instinctively stepped back. She recognized the line had been crossed, but said nothing. I need to be present in court, Celeste stated, her voice clear and steady. Then you'll follow my protocol, Riker snapped. Random screening. Come with me. He didn't wait for a response. He gripped her arm and led her into a private room behind the security zone. No windows, cold and silent. A metal chair sat in the center. A cart of screening equipment stood to one side. A pair of hair-cutting shears rested casually on the edge of a table. Celeste felt her heartbeat drop once, deep, cautious, and alert. I do not consent to this, she stated firmly. You have no legal basis to detain me. Your behavior is suspicious. That's reason enough, Riker growled, pointing to the metal chair. Sit down. Celeste didn't move. She didn't back down, didn't resist. Just looked him in the eyes, her stare silently declaring, I know who I am. Do you? Riker leaned in, his breath heavy with the stench of abused authority. That badge you just flashed? Doesn't mean a damn thing in here. Not to me. The door behind them swung open. Two more security guards entered, one bald man with shifty, worried eyes, the other gripping the back of the chair tightly. Before Celeste could react, her left wrist was seized. "This is an unlawful act," she said loudly. "I demand your names." No one answered. Riker picked up a pair of electric clippers. "What do you think you're doing?" Celeste's voice hardened. "Standard procedure," he said, nodding toward her curly silver hair. "You might be hiding something in there." Celeste bolted upright, but a rough hand shoved her back into the chair. The clippers whirred to life, a harsh, angry buzz like a swarm of wasps echoing in the sealed room. Before she could resist, the cold blade touched her scalp. A thick strand of silver hair fell to the floor, then another, and another. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't blink. She just sat there, as pieces of memory were cut away and fragments of dignity scattered onto the cold tile floor. A faint chuckle rose from behind. "Looking better already," one of the guards sneered. Riker brushed hair off his sleeve, his tone dripping with disdain. "Gotta show some respect for this place. You look more presentable now." Celeste clenched her fists. Her knuckles turned white from the pressure. But when she spoke, her voice remained as calm as a midnight lake. "You'll regret this." Riker leaned in, smirking. "Women like you always say that." Then, as if nothing had happened, he opened the door and gestured outward. "You're free to go. Courtroom's that way, ma'am." Celeste rose slowly, her hands trembling just slightly. She walked out, retrieving her badge from the desk without a word. Her heels echoed rhythmically down the long hallway. Her face gave nothing away. No expression, no emotion that could be read. But inside her chest, a fire blazed. Not anger, conviction, purpose, justice torn apart, soon to be stitched back together by the weight of the law. What would you think if the woman humiliated that morning turned out to be the very one holding the scales of justice minutes later? Have you ever witnessed a similar abuse where someone in power was the first to dishonor another? Share below. Your story may awaken more people than you think. Because what Riker never knew was that Celeste hadn't come to observe. She wasn't a defendant, not a witness. She was the judge, and she was about to take the bench. The buzzing of the clippers still echoed in her ears like a war anthem. Each step toward the courtroom grew heavier, not with fear, but with the weight of tightly coiled fury. Her scalp still ached where each silver curl had once connected her to heritage, family, history, identity. Now it was only patches of raw skin, evidence of a deliberate act of humiliation. The hallway was suffocatingly silent. She passed two clerks. They glanced at her, then quickly looked away. They'd heard, maybe even seen it, but none of them spoke. Celeste kept walking. She didn't pause, wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her falter, not even in a flicker. At the end of the hall, murmurs began seeping from the double doors of the courtroom. Today was a high-profile hearing, a session on police misconduct. The case had made national headlines. Several officers stood accused of excessive force during last year's protest. The press was packed in, cameras ready, all eyes on the court. Normally Celeste would have entered from the private judge's corridor where her robe awaited ceremony and tact. But today ceremony meant nothing. She stopped before the courtroom doors, took a deep breath, and pushed both open wide. Silence fell instantly. Conversation ceased. Every head turned as if drawn by a magnet. And in that moment, people began to understand. Her footsteps echoed across the marble floor, deliberate and firm, as she passed rows of attorneys, journalists, plaintiffs, and defendants. Some stared in disbelief. Others looked stunned, like they were witnessing something unreal. At the far end of the courtroom, the judge's bench remained empty. Only when Celeste approached did they realize. The woman who had been dragged through the hallway like a criminal was the one holding the gavel. The shaved patches on her head, scars of a brutal humiliation, were no longer symbols of victimhood. They were the beginning of a declaration of war. She stepped behind the bench, stood tall, looked over the room with a gaze as cold and steady as steel. Not the calm of peace, but of disciplined resolve sharpened by purpose. A pen fell near the defense table. No one picked it up. The guard, the one with the clippers, was still stationed at the side entrance, When Celeste's eyes locked on his body froze like stone. His face went pale, his lips moved, but no words came out. Celeste didn't blink. She reached for the judge's robe draped neatly over the chair. No one helped. She didn't need them to. Each movement slow, deliberate, powerful. As the robe fell across her shoulders like armor on a warrior stepping into battle, she turned to the court clerk. "Is today's docket ready?" The clerk's voice trembled. Yes, Your Honor." Celeste gave a subtle nod, then sat in the seat of authority, the creak of the leather beneath her echoing like the sound of a sword being drawn, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't glance at the man who had humiliated her. Not yet. No rush. "We begin with preliminary testimony in case 2371 F. Fighted, United States versus Charleston Police Department," she said, her voice calm to the point of being unnerving. "Charges include abuse of authority, excessive use of force, and violation of civil rights. Are all parties present?" A chorus of murmurs followed. "Yes, Your Honor." Attorneys shuffled in their seats. Some widened their eyes in disbelief, others lowered their heads, burdened by guilt, and a few were angry. Angry that a black woman dared to return, strong, unbroken, and far from defeated. Celeste ignored them. "Let's proceed," she said. The first witness was called, a police officer who had been present during the protests that year. The man now standing at the witness stand had once shoved an elderly veteran to the ground during a peaceful demonstration, a fall that fractured two of the man's ribs. Celeste listened without blinking, taking notes steadily but asking no questions. Not yet. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Riker inching backward toward the rear of the courtroom. His hands fidgeted near his belt, his feet shifted restlessly, as if he wished he could vanish on the spot. And just as he feared, the moment was coming. After the second witness, Celeste called for a recess. The courtroom slowly emptied. Even the lawyers whispered to one another, as if afraid to disturb the sacred silence hanging in the air. Celeste remained seated. A few minutes later, only she, the court clerk, two officers, and Riker remained. Only then did she look at him. "Deputy Riker," she said, voice sharp as shattered glass. He froze mid-step, stepped forward, his mouth open, stammering, "Yes, Your Honor." She motioned for him to move to the center of the courtroom, the very place where defendants had stood before. Now he walked as if approaching a cliff's edge. "State your full name for the record." He blinked. "Excuse me? You hurt me." Hank Riker." "How long have you served at this courthouse?" 14 years. Celeste tapped her pen lightly against her file. Once, twice, then leaned forward. "And in those 14 years, how many women have you assaulted in that security screening room?" The color drained from his face. "Your Honor, I don't know. It's not the question I asked." He looked around, desperate for help, but no one spoke. "How many complaints have been filed against you, Deputy Riker?" "I'm not sure." Celeste's voice didn't rise, but each word cut like a blade. 12. 12 formal complaints, all buried, all dismissed, because you hid behind so-called procedures and protocol." His lips trembled. I didn't know who you were. I thought." "Exactly," Celeste snapped, her voice finally cracking with long-restrained fury. "Who did you think I was? Just another black woman you could bully, shave bald, humiliate like some sick game?" The room was dead silent. No one moved. "You didn't even ask for my name." Riker tried to speak, but no sound came out. Celeste slowly rose from the bench. "Because of you, this place, this so-called temple of justice, has been desecrated. Because of your actions, the integrity of this court is now in question. And because you assaulted a federal judge in the very courthouse she serves, effective immediately, you are the subject of a criminal investigation." She turned to the two officers near the door. "Take Deputy Riker into custody. Isolate him from the general holding cells. Formal charges will follow." The officers moved quickly. The handcuffs were already in their hands. No, wait. You can't do this." Riker screamed, thrashing. But he was wrong. She not only could, she already had. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of trial. It had become a site of reckoning, where the underestimated rose and forced an entire system to bow. Deputy Hank Riker, once the symbol of unchecked authority and fear in that courthouse, was now reduced to a memory. Led away in handcuffs, badge revoked, power stripped. But the echoes of his actions lingered. They crept through every pause, every too loud ceiling fan, and every sideways glance from staff who had known for years and chosen silence. Celeste Monroe sat back down, fingers interlaced on the bench. The black robe draped over her shoulders no longer symbolized power. It had become armor for the truth. There was no going back to the way things were. And truthfully, she didn't want to, because something had changed, not just within her, but in the very atmosphere of the courtroom. The clerk entered quietly, holding a new file. "Your Honor," she said carefully, "the next witnesses are getting ready." Celeste nodded. "About 8 minutes." She glanced toward the public gallery, soon to be filled with jurors, reporters, and civilians. But in her mind, Riker's image lingered, a spreading stain on the polished marble floor. She exhaled. The day had already spiraled far beyond expectation, and it wasn't even noon. A soft creak echoed behind her. Celeste turned. A young woman entered, early 20s, glasses fogged from rushing down the hall. It was Megan, one of the interns, smart, quiet, and usually only spoke when addressed. Megan looked pale. Celeste gave her a small nod. "Everything all right?" Megan hesitated, then closed the door and stepped forward. I just wanted to say, I saw what happened this morning outside the security checkpoint with Deputy Riker. I didn't know what to do. I should have said something. I was scared." Celeste remained silent. She watched the girl's trembling hands. Then gently she said, "Thank you for speaking up. That matters." "But I didn't stop it." "No," Celeste replied. "But you're speaking now, and that's something most others won't do." Megan nearly broke into tears, but then lifted her chin. "Steadier now. If you need me to testify, I will." Celeste reached across the table, placing her hand lightly over Megan's, a silent moment of warmth between two people who had both once been forced into silence. Just then the door opened again, this time heavier, more deliberate. The public was returning. Celeste stood. "All rise," the clerk called, voice more confident than before. Everyone complied, even those who had laughed along with Riker's cruelty behind closed doors. Celeste took her seat at the bench. Court is back in session. The next witness was called to the stand. The air had shifted. There was no longer uncertainty about who held authority. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. Howard Briggs stepped forward, a middle-aged black man, warehouse worker, gray in his beard, his hands worn from decades of labor. His eyes were sunken, but they burned with determination. He had come to speak about his son, a 17-year-old boy pinned to the ground by police during a peaceful protest. One of the officers present, sitting right there, had driven his knee into the boy's neck, cutting off his airway. The boy survived miraculously, but since that day he hadn't been able to speak above a whisper. It had happened 9 months ago. Howard told the whole story, how he begged the medics, how he was dismissed because he's just faking it, and how even after video footage leaked, not a single officer faced discipline. Celeste didn't interrupt him once. She didn't need to. Every word he spoke was a blade, sharp, deliberate, slicing through the courtroom's air, leaving wounds that could not be ignored. When he finished, Celeste leaned forward. "Mr. Briggs, thank you for your courage. I know this wasn't easy." He nodded, voice trembling. "I just want to know if what I said even matters. That someone finally listened." Celeste looked at him, not from the judge's bench, not as a jurist, but as someone who had once been silenced too. "You've been heard," she said. A few minutes later, as Mr. Briggs stepped down and passed by the very officers who had nearly taken his son's life, Celeste called for a short recess. Her chambers were unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that forces a person to confront themselves. She sat in front of the sink, looking straight into the mirror above it. Her hair, unevenly cut with a raw red patch above her left ear, no longer reflected the image of a judge, The woman staring back looked like she'd just come from a battlefield. But maybe that's exactly what justice was never meant to be. A performance. Not the calm, polished poise shaped by ceremony, but a fight for truth. And Celeste had no intention of losing. A knock at the door. Her clerk opened it a crack. "Your Honor, the DA's office just filed an emergency motion, sealed. They're moving to immediately escalate the charges against Riker. Violation of civil rights under federal law." Celeste didn't blink. Good, granted. Once the door closed again, she allowed herself to exhale. Not out of relief, but out of resolve. Today wasn't over. Not even close. Because even though the courtroom had witnessed Riker fall, they had yet to see what was coming next. And the real battle was still ahead. The courtroom filled up again. But the atmosphere had changed. Something heavy now hung in the air, like static before a thunderstorm. A pressure that made people sit straighter, speak softer, and think twice before assuming who held the power. Celeste Monroe returned to the bench without announcement. No more introductions, no ceremonial fanfare, just the echo of her heels on the hardwood and the soft brush of her robe as she sat. Everyone stood, reflexively. Even those who had once scoffed at her couldn't remain seated. She didn't speak right away. She scanned the room. From defendants to attorneys, reporters to the hushed crowd, every eye was on her. They wanted to see how far she would go. Was this just a moment, or the beginning of a movement? Celeste tapped the gavel lightly against the desk. "This court is back in session." Order fell into place instantly. She looked to the prosecution. "Call your next witness." Silence returned as a police officer stepped forward. Lieutenant Daniel Cook. Tall, muscular, clean-shaven, posture stiff like a parade ground soldier. The type of man who believed the badge on his chest was an invincible shield. Cook sat down, cleared his throat, and clasped his hands in his lap. Celeste studied him for a long moment. She knew his kind, polished, confident, trained to lie with a smile and never break a sweat. The prosecutor began the questioning, each inquiry sharp and precise like a scalpel. "Lieutenant Cook, you were present at the protest on May 14th of last year, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. And during that time you commanded a team of 7 officers." "That's correct. Did you personally authorize the use of force against protesters?" Cook leaned into the microphone, voice poised like he was giving a press briefing. "I authorized the use of non-lethal crowd control measures after protesters began acting aggressively. There were shouts, pushing, some were carrying bottles and rocks," he testified. "Were any of your officers injured?" "No, Your Honor." "And the protesters?" "Just minor injuries, mostly bruises." Celeste cut in, her voice slicing through the room like a blade. "Lieutenant Cook," he turned to her. "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you consider a crushed trachea a minor injury?" The room froze. "Of course not, Your Honor." Celeste leaned forward. "Then why does the official report describe it as soft tissue damage consistent with resistance?" Cook hesitated. This was standard language, based on preliminary impressions. "Whose impressions?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I believe Officer Valdez wrote that section." Celeste's gaze remained cold and steady. "And you reviewed and approved it?" A pause. "Yes, Your Honor," knowing full well that the victim was an unarmed 17-year-old. His mouth opened, then closed. Finally, he murmured, "Yes." Celeste's tone didn't waver. "You believe justice was served that day?" Silence. I believe we followed protocol." She leaned back, arms crossed. That wasn't the question. Cook cleared his throat, struggling to regain composure. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm not in a position to answer that. That's not my role." Celeste nodded slowly. "No, it's mine." She turned to the prosecutor. "Proceed." The remainder of the testimony was dry, procedural, but each word pricked the air like needles against skin, not just because of the truths they held, but because of how they were wrapped in the language of normalization, justification, and passive acceptance. Even though the courtroom had already witnessed Riker's fall, they had not yet seen what came next. The real fight was still ahead. The courtroom was packed once again, but the air had changed. Something hung silently over the room, like static before a storm. a pressure that made people sit straighter, speak softer, and reconsider before questioning who was really in charge. Celeste Monroe stepped back to the bench without need for introduction. No announcement, no formalities. Just the echo of her heels on wood and the soft whisper of her robe as she sat. Everyone stood automatically. Even those who once looked down on her couldn't stay seated. She didn't speak immediately. She observed, from the defendants to the lawyers, from the reporters to the silent crowd. Every eye was on her. They wanted to see how far she would go. Was this just a moment? Or the beginning of something bigger? Celeste tapped the gavel gently on the desk. Court is now in session. Order returned in an instant. She turned to the prosecution. Call your next witness. The room fell into silence again as a police officer took the stand. Lieutenant Daniel Cook. Tall, muscular, clean-shaven, posture rigid like a parade soldier, the kind of man who believed the badge on his chest made him untouchable. Cook sat down, cleared his throat, hands clasped in his lap. Celeste studied him for a long moment. She knew this type. Polished, confident, trained to lie, with a smile and never break a sweat. The prosecutor began, every question precise and surgical. Lieutenant Cook, you were present at the protest on May 14 last year, correct? Yes, ma'am. And during that time, you commanded a unit of 7 officers? That's right. Did you personally authorize the use of force on the protesters? Cook leaned into the microphone, sounding like he was at a press conference. I authorized the use of non-lethal crowd control measures once the protesters began behaving aggressively. There were shouts, some pushing, a few were carrying bottles and rocks, he added. The injuries among your officers? No, Your Honor. And the protesters? Minor injuries, mostly bruises. Celeste cut in sharply. Lieutenant Cook. He turned toward her. Yes, Your Honor. Do you consider a crushed windpipe a minor injury? The room froze. Of course not, Your Honor. Celeste leaned forward. Then why does the official report describe it as soft tissue damage consistent with resistance? Cook hesitated. That was standard phrasing. Based on the initial impression. Whose impression? He shifted in his seat. I believe Officer Valdez wrote that section. Celeste's gaze remained cold. And you reviewed and approved it? A pause. Yes, Your Honor. Knowing full well the victim was an unarmed 17-year-old, his mouth opened, then shut. Finally he whispered. Yes. Her voice didn't change. Do you believe justice was served that day? Silence. I believe we followed protocol. She leaned back, arms crossed. That's not what I asked. Cook cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. With all due respect, Your Honor, I can't answer that. That's not my role. Celeste nodded slowly. No, that's mine. She turned to the prosecutor. Proceed. The rest of the testimony was clinical, dry. But each word pierced the room like a needle, not just for what it revealed, but for how carefully it was framed to make the unacceptable sound normal. During the next recess, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters hammered at their keyboards like possessed. Activists scribbled furiously. A woman in the back row clutched her chest and whispered, "Thank you," as Celeste passed. In her chambers, Celeste removed her robe and hung it on the rack. She stood still, staring at it. On the hook, it looked simple, harmless. But beyond those doors, it was weight, a symbol, a mantle that made people rise, listen, and fear. And then she remembered, just 2 hours earlier, with that same face, that same heart, that same dignity, but without the robe, she had been humiliated, as if she were no one. That contradiction now lived in her bones. It burned behind her eyes, echoed in every heartbeat. Your Honor? It was the clerk. Someone from the Department of Justice is here. They say it's urgent. Celeste straightened. Send them in. Man in a gray suit stepped inside. Calm, professional. He handed her a sealed envelope. Judge Monroe, I'm from the Civil Rights Division. We were deployed the moment reports came in about this morning's incident. Fast response, Celeste said, opening the envelope. This courthouse is now under federal review. What occurred in that screening room wasn't just an internal breach. It was a violation of Title 18, a federal criminal offense. And when we learned the victim was a sitting federal judge, he left the sentence unfinished. Celeste said nothing. She didn't need to. He continued, we'll be launching a full investigation into the Charleston courthouse staff, suppressed complaints, obstruction of reporting, and signs of internal cover-ups. Good, she said quietly. Start with the ones who buried those 12 complaints against Riker. Then move on to the judges who blindly signed off on them. He nodded as if expecting her to say that. Oh, and one more thing, Judge Monroe. He paused at the door. You should know, video from this morning has gone viral. CNN, MSNBC, social media, it's everywhere. Even a few senators are now talking about it. Celeste shook her head lightly. I didn't do it for them, the man smiled, which is exactly why it matters. After he left, Celeste slowly took a seat. Outside, defense attorneys began filing in. The shuffle of shoes, rustle of papers, final whispers before the lines were drawn. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready, because today wasn't just about exposing a racist cop. It was about stripping the mask off a system that had worn justice like a disguise for far too long, and the cracks were just beginning to show. The courtroom was packed. News spread like wildfire about the arrest, about the video, about the woman behind it all. A federal judge walked into a courthouse and was treated like she didn't belong. Then, minutes later, rose to the bench, bruised, violated, but unshaken. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Cameras lined up outside. Reporters filled the back rows. Civil rights attorneys flew in from Atlanta, Washington, D.C., even Chicago. The tension was thick, electric. This was no longer a trial. It was a reckoning, a moment in history where justice and reality collided in real time. Celeste stood behind the bench. The clerk leaned in and whispered, "They're here, the defense attorneys. They've requested a special counsel." He raised an eyebrow. On what grounds? They say the case is compromised, that the judge has lost objectivity. Celeste exhaled slowly. Of course, when they can't deny the truth, they attack the one delivering it. Let them file, she said. I'll respond. In writing. On the record. She stepped out. The room held its breath. I'll rise. Everyone obeyed. She didn't look left or right, just moved forward, tapped the gavel lightly. Be seated. The tension eased, like air after a storm. A lawyer in a pinstripe suit stood, around 50, with a voice trained for both courtroom argument and cable news interviews. Your Honor, before we proceed, we'd like to enter a formal motion given the recent events. Celeste cut him off. You're referring to the arrest of Deputy Riker and this morning's incident in the courthouse hallway. He faltered. Yes, Your Honor. And you're concerned? These events may present a conflict of interest and raise questions about the court's objectivity. The room murmured, restless whispers spilling over. Celeste didn't blink. You're suggesting that because I was assaulted this morning, I am now unfit to perform my duties? I mean, the attorney said cautiously, a perception of bias? Celeste raised her hand to cut him off. Let me stop you right there. She stood and walked slowly to the edge of the bench. I was assaulted. Publicly, humiliated, not for what I said, not for what I did, but for who I am. Because someone saw a black woman walk into a courthouse and assumed she couldn't possibly be in power. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. And what did I do after that? I took the bench. I presided over this courtroom. I followed every rule, every canon of judicial ethics. I remained calm, professional, respectful, even when others didn't. The attorney's jaw tightened. Celeste's voice turned razor sharp. Do you know what actual bias looks like, counselor? It looks like a man shaving a woman's head with clippers. No cause, no warrant, not even asking her name. It looks like 12 complaints ignored, filed by people who looked like me, buried by the very system that was supposed to protect them. So, Sando, what is there? She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. Want to talk about conflicts of interest? Let's talk about how many judges signed off on Riker's behavior over the years. How many prosecutors declined to investigate? Let's talk about your law firm's history, defending officers whose violence reports are longer than their resumes. The attorney looked like he might object, but didn't. Because she was right. Celeste stood tall, her shoulders steady. This court will proceed. I will not recuse myself. And if you truly believe that the facts of this case cannot stand under my authority, feel free to appeal. I'll have the paperwork ready for you." She tapped the gavel lightly. "Next witness." The prosecutor called a new name. Not a victim, not a protester. A former court employee, a middle-aged black woman in a sharp suit, cropped hair, glasses, named Denise Talley. Celeste recognized her immediately, not just from personnel files. Denise had once run the records department, quiet, precise, never complained, and today she stepped into the light. Denise was sworn in, sat down, adjusted her blazer. The prosecutor approached. "Miss Talley, please tell the court about your prior position here." "I was the records supervisor for 8 years. Before that, I worked the front desk." "During your time, were you ever aware of complaints filed against Deputy Riker?" Her eyes hardened. "Yes, more than I could count." "Can you estimate?" 12 formal complaints. At least twice as many informal reports. "What happened to those complaints?" Denise glanced at Celeste, then spoke slowly. "They were mishandled. Some were marked resolved without any follow-up. Some disappeared entirely." The courtroom murmured. "Who gave the order?" She paused, then answered, "Judge Taryn Mahoney." The name hit like a lightning strike. Mahoney, retired just 6 months ago. Spotless reputation. Widely respected, even a former mentor to Celeste herself. Now the truth stood naked, unavoidable. "Why did he cover them up?" the prosecutor asked. Denise's voice trembled, but she replied. Mosh said, "Going public would destroy public trust, that it would make the court look weak." Celeste sat perfectly still, because she had heard those exact words before. Justice delayed to protect appearances. Use excused in the name of order. She looked around the room. Faces that once looked away, not anymore, because in that moment, some finally understood what they had been serving all this time wasn't justice, it was silence. Denise went on, her voice steadier now. "I saw people like Riker walk these halls untouched. I saw black interns get searched, questioned. I saw witnesses intimidated and dismissed. Every time I spoke up, they told me, 'That's just how it is.'" Her voice cracked. "It's not how it is anymore." Celeste swallowed hard. This wasn't just testimony supporting a case. It was a blade slicing through the system itself. She called for a recess. Everyone stood as Celeste stepped down from the bench. A young reporter whispered, "She's not just running the trial, she's rewriting it." And he was right. Because this was no longer just a trial. This was a reckoning, a wake-up call echoing farther than anyone had imagined. By the afternoon, the courthouse steps were no longer empty. What had started with a few reporters had grown into a sea of people, protesters and community leaders, young, old, black, white, holding signs high. Some held nothing at all, just standing there watching, not chaos, but clarity. A kind of waiting charged with historic weight. From her office window, Celeste looked down. She read the signs raised skyward. "Justice starts now. Protect black women." 12 complaints. 0 accountability. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to feel all of it. The pressure, the truth, the voices that had once been buried now rising. Another knock at the door. Was her clerk. But this time, behind her stood a man, someone Celeste hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Reverend Marcus Hill. He stepped forward with the calm presence of a man who had seen too much, and still chose to keep fighting. His beard was now gray since the last time Celeste saw him. His eyes were tired, but still warm. "Judge Monroe," he said. "Reverend," she replied, rising to her feet. "I won't take much of your time. I just want you to know we're out there. We see what you're doing, and we stand with you." Celeste nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. He handed her a folded sheet of paper. "There are people outside, victims too, not just of Riker, but of men like him. They've never been called to testify, never been heard. But now they're ready. If you want, they'll speak." She opened the paper, a list of names, phone numbers, handwritten notes in black ink. The strokes a little shaky, more than she expected. "How many new cases?" she asked. "Most of them. Some were years ago, some were too scared, some were told it's not worth it." Celeste looked up. "They were wrong. Now, it is worth it. Marcus smiled gently. Because of you it became worth it. She didn't reply. But the silence between them said more than words ever could. After he left, Celeste looked down at the list again. These weren't just names. They were people the system had ignored, dismissed, mocked, cast aside. Not anymore. Back in the courtroom, the gallery had doubled in size. Word of Denise Talley's testimony had spread like wildfire. Multiple media outlets were now broadcasting live. Outside, people crowded around windows watching the live stream in the brisk October sun. But inside them burned a fire, the fire of justice. When Celeste re-entered, the room rose again, but this time not just for her title, for what she represented. She tapped the gavel lightly. Let's continue. The next witness surprised everyone, a member of the U.S. Marshal's office. But he hadn't come to investigate, he had come to testify. His name was Andrew Taylor, a black man in his late 50s. Over 20 years of service. A slight limp from an arrest gone wrong back in 2001. He had once worked in this very courthouse. Now he returned, carrying a truth too heavy to keep anymore. Taylor took the oath, sat down, adjusted the mic. I worked here from 2004 to 2012. I saw a lot. Most of it I let slide. I didn't want trouble. Didn't want to be labeled the angry black cop. He looked directly at Celeste. But what I saw from Riker, I should have reported it. I didn't, and I regret that. Celeste nodded, giving him space. It started as rude comments, aggressive checks on young black men, little jabs. Then it escalated. By 2010, he wasn't just abrasive, he was dangerous. Did you report it? The prosecutor asked. I submitted a memo to Internal Affairs, but it vanished. Where I followed up, I was told, word for word, he's the kind of guy we need to handle the tough ones. The courtroom erupted. Outraged murmurs broke out. Celeste struck the gavel for order. Taylor leaned forward and continued. I left this courthouse 2 years later, not because of the job, but because of what it was doing to me, the silence, the guilt. But today, I'm here to speak the truth. Because, Judge Monroe, the fact that you sat back down in that chair after what they did to you, that means more than your title. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. And for the first time all day, Celeste said nothing. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because some moments in history speak for themselves. You let them echo. The next morning, the air outside the courthouse hung heavy, like gray clouds suspended over the Charleston sky. Cold and thick, like a warning. But inside Judge Celeste Monroe's chambers, the silence was colder than the October air outside. She sat quietly at her desk, staring at a thick manila folder labeled Classified Internal File. It had been handed to her by a court administrator without a word, just a quick nod, and placed on her desk like it was burning hot to the touch. Celeste opened it slowly. Inside were memos, internal notes, emails, reports, signatures, and 12 formal complaints against Deputy Hank Riker spanning 15 years, all of them dismissed, and all of them approved by a name she knew all too well, Judge Terrence Mahoney, the same man who once mentored her, who helped usher her into the federal judiciary, the man who once told her, "You're exactly the kind of person this court needs." And now his signature appeared at the bottom of every dismissal form, rubber-stamped with bureaucratic indifference, insufficient grounds, lack of supporting evidence, no further action needed. At the end of the file, one note stood out, a confidential communication between Mahoney and the courthouse's head of security from 5 years ago. Celeste read it once, then again. Riker can be rough around the edges, but he maintains order, especially with certain groups. Best to leave things as they are. Celise's fingers clenched around the page, crumpling it until it wrinkled in her fist. This wasn't veiled, it wasn't coded. It was the truth, spoken plainly. And now this wasn't just about Riker anymore. It was about the entire system that protected him, enabled him, encouraged his brutality. So long as he kept order. Celeste leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. This was no longer a trial. This was a purge. She looked down at her polished desk, her own reflection staring back. Uneven hair, tired eyes, but the fire behind them still burned. A knock at the door. Who is the clerk? Your Honor, she said softly, we've just received a letter of inquiry from the Senate Judiciary Committee. They're requesting your position on the oversight failures involving judicial conduct in relation to the Riker case. Celeste let out a dry laugh, not from amusement but bitter irony. Of course. Now that the cameras are on, everyone wants to play the hero. The clerk hesitated. There's more. 3 retired judges and a former prosecutor just submitted their resignations this morning, citing health reasons. Celeste said nothing. She stood. Call in all the attorneys, everyone. We're finishing this today. An hour later, the courtroom was packed to capacity. But this time, it wasn't just locals. Reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, even BBC had filled the back rows. A line of black law students sat shoulder to shoulder in the front row, legal pads in hand, eyes shining with purpose. Because this wasn't just Charleston's story anymore. It was national. Celeste stepped up to the bench. He struck the gavel. This court is now in session. She scanned the room. Before we move to closing arguments, I'm entering a new record into the case file. She nodded. The clerk handed copies to both legal teams. This is the complete set of complaints against Deputy Riker, along with all internal communications concerning their suppression, and a list of individuals who signed off on those dismissals. A defense attorney began to rise in objection. Celeste raised a hand, her voice soft but unwavering. Sit down. She looked directly at the courtroom. Let it be stated for the record, this court will no longer protect institutions by sacrificing people. We will no longer pretend that silence is neutrality. Her gaze moved slowly across every face in the room. Every signature in this file was a choice, not a mistake. A choice to dismiss the harmed, a choice to protect the abuser, a choice to preserve an illusion of order built on fear. Then she turned to face the defense attorney. The choice ends today. The room went still, so still you could hear someone stop writing mid-sentence. Then a voice rose from the back corner of the courtroom. Your Honor, an older man, maybe in his 60s, stood silently near the doorway. Your Honor, may I speak? The entire courtroom froze. Then Celeste gave a small nod. The man stepped forward, holding an old worn hat in trembling hands. My name is Louis Bryant, he said, voice hoarse with emotion. I was arrested in this very building back in 2011 because I raised my voice when my daughter's case was dismissed. Riker slammed me against the wall, broke 2 of my ribs. Celeste nodded, eyes never leaving him. Did you file a complaint? I did, right at the front desk over there. And they told me I must have slipped and fallen. That's what the report said. After that, I never came back. He looked around the room, eyes heavy with pain and time. But today, I'm here. Celeste rose to her feet, facing the gallery. Is there anyone else? A long pause, and then hands began to rise. 10, 15 people, each with a story, each with a silence that had lasted too long. And now, finally a voice. Celeste didn't cry. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching as truth filled the room around her. No more whispers, no more hiding, no more protection by robes or badges. Only voices, clear and undeniable. The final day of the hearing began with rain. Not a soft drizzle, not a cleansing rain, but a relentless downpour, as if all of Charleston had been swept into both a warning and a reckoning. Flooded streets, power lines swaying in the wind. And still they came, reporters, protesters, ward staff, interns, witnesses. They came with umbrellas, raincoats, cameras, and handmade signs, because by now everyone understood what was happening in that courtroom was no longer just about justice. His history being rewritten in real time. Your Honor, may I speak? The courtroom froze again. Celeste gave a quiet nod. The man stepped forward, clutching his hat with shaking hands. My name is Louis Bryant, he said, voice breaking. I was arrested in this courthouse in 2011 because I raised my voice when my daughter's case was thrown out. He slammed me into the wall, Broke 2 ribs. Celeste nodded, eyes locked on him. Did you file a complaint? I filed it myself, right at the reception desk. And they told me I slipped and fell. That's what the report said. I never came back. He looked around, voice aching. But today, I'm here. Celeste stood, turning to the room. Is there anyone else? Silence. Then slowly, arms began to rise. 10, 15 people. Each with a story, each with a silence stretched across years. And now at last a voice. Celeste didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't flinch. She simply stood there, steady as the truth surged around her, no longer hidden, no longer protected by robes or ranks, but spoken, loud and unshaken. The final day of the hearing began with relentless rain, not a gentle drizzle or a cleansing downpour, but a torrential storm, as if Charleston itself was being swept into both a warning and a reckoning. And still they came. Reporters, protesters, court staff, interns, witnesses, carrying umbrellas, raincoats, cameras, and signs, because by now everyone understood what was happening inside that courtroom was no longer just justice. It was history being rewritten. Inside, the air was strangely quiet, tense, like the moment before a storm break. Celeste Monroe entered without a word. No gavel strike, no declaration. She stood before the bench, looked out at the packed courtroom, then quietly removed her robe. She folded it neatly, placed it on the chair, and stood there, no longer shielded by title or tradition, just a woman who had been violated and who was still standing. Then she spoke. I've sat behind this bench for years. I've worn the robe, held the title, issued rulings, followed procedure. But I've also stayed silent for too long. And today, I am silent no more. She turned to the defense table, then the prosecution, then to the room filled with citizens who had once been silenced and cast aside, now watching her intently. This court finds Deputy Hank Riker guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, misconduct in the execution of his duties. But she didn't stop. She stepped forward. This court also recommends a full review of all complaints ever filed under his name and calls for a thorough investigation into any individual who suppressed those reports. She turned to the clerk. Enter it into the record. No applause followed. Only a heavy silence, like the quiet after an explosion. Then she reached down and lifted a folder that had never been opened in court before. She held it high. This is a proposed policy effective immediately. I call it the Monroe Doctrine. Heads lifted. Surprise flickered. It mandates comprehensive anti-BS training, routine psychological evaluations, ongoing performance assessments, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior among all federal court security staff, federal law enforcement, and courthouse personnel. She held the folder higher. And I will take this to the federal system, to the Supreme Court, to the Senate, if I must. Because what happened to me should never happen to anyone, and I will make sure it never does. The courtroom remained still. No cheers, but people nodded slowly. Some cried. Some held each other's hands. And Celeste continued, let me be clear, this is not about revenge. It's about responsibility. It's about truth. It's about looking a broken system in the eye and saying, no, no more. She turned toward the defense attorneys and the officials who had allowed Riker to operate unchecked for over a decade, without consequence. Consider this your formal warning. She tapped the file lightly. I will submit a petition to the Department of Justice to review disbarment, conduct investigations, and pursue potential criminal charges against any individual who contributed to covering up this truth. The courtroom fell into an absolute stillness. No one even seemed to breathe. Then Celeste looked up, her eyes drawn toward the tall arched window behind the gallery. Outside, the storm still raged, but the first rays of sunlight had begun to pierce through, casting light onto the marble floor, like a silent, resolute sign. She gave a small nod, as if she'd been waiting for that exact moment. Before we close, there's one more matter. She motioned toward the side door. 2 officers opened it. Hank Riker entered, still in handcuffs, no longer in uniform. His face was pale, hollow, broken, not from bruises, but from the collapse of what he had built himself upon. He was brought to the front, standing beside his public defender. Celeste faced him, not with vengeance, but with a fire that could no longer be extinguished. "Mr. Hank Riker," she said, "this court sentences you to the maximum penalty under federal law. 6 years in prison for abuse of power, 5 years for violation of civil rights, and 1 additional year for obstruction of justice." She paused. "But that's just the legal part." Riker didn't lift his head. Celeste lowered her voice, sharp as a scalpel. "And this is the part meant for the human being." She looked straight at him. "Your entire career you appointed yourself the authority on who deserved respect and who didn't. You thought the badge was a shield. You thought silence would protect you. You thought people like me would never hold the gavel of justice." Her gaze etched itself into him. "But now you will sit in the same seat you once forced others into. No badge, no robe, just the weight of what you've done." She nodded to the 2 officers. "Take him away." As Riker was escorted out of the courtroom, no one clapped. No one cheered. They simply watched. Because this was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment of witnessing, and sometimes bearing witness holds more power than 1,000 rounds of applause. Celeste looked down at the folder labeled "The Monroe Doctrine." She closed it, lifted her robe from the back of her chair, and spoke one final time. "Court is adjourned." The courtroom gradually emptied like a storm receding. 1 drop, 1 person at a time. No one rushed. They lingered, spoke in hushed tones, embraced one another. A few stopped to rest their hands on the railing or the courtroom door, as if for the first time a space once cold and untouchable had become something they could finally feel. Celeste sat alone in her chambers. The case files were gone, the courtroom silent. The robe still hung behind her chair, just like always. But this time it felt different, lighter, not because the weight had disappeared, but because the truth had finally been spoken. She turned her chair toward the mirror behind her desk. Her reflection stared back. Her regrowing hair, uneven patches, silver curls slowly returning. Once her crown, now growing back, unruly, defiant. Part of her wanted to hide it, to smooth out the scars, to flatten what was still raw. A knock broke the silence. It was Nanny, her sister. She said nothing, just walked in, pulled a folding chair from the corner, and sat behind Celeste. She plugged in a small clipper. "You ready?" Nain asked. Celeste looked into her sister's eyes in the mirror. No fear remained, only resolve. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's finish this." The hand began, slow, gentle. Each pass of the clippers cut away not shame, but the remnants of a wound not yet healed. The falling strands of hair weren't humiliation. They weren't violence. They were choice. They were a new beginning. When she finished, Nain handed Celeste a mirror. Celeste took it, tilted slightly, and looked. What she saw was strength, bare, unapologetic, breathtaking. You could walk into any room with a head like that and make the whole world go silent, Nayan said with a radiant smile. Celeste didn't answer immediately. She just kept looking, not to find herself again, but to truly see herself for the first time. "This is who I am now," Celeste said quietly. "No," Nayan replied, calm but certain. "This is who you've always been. The world's just finally catching up." They both smiled, a wordless smile full of knowing and soul-deep recognition. That night, Celeste left the courthouse. No wig, no scarf, no hat, just her bare head lifted proudly beneath the city lights. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, a small group of people quietly noticed her. No cameras, no reporters, just people. A woman in her 70s, brown-skinned, thick glasses, walked up and gently placed a hand over Celeste's. "I never thought I'd live long enough to see someone like you do what you just did," the woman said, voice trembling. Celeste took her hand. "You didn't just survive," she said. "You made the way." Behind her, a teenage boy stepped forward. Shy, silent, he pulled down the hood of his sweatshirt to reveal a freshly shaved head. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded. Celeste nodded back. Between them, something passed. No words, no explanation. Just a quiet legacy being passed on. That night, Celeste stood on her front porch, looking out over the quiet neighborhood. The porch light flickered faintly. Wind rustled through the rows of oak trees. Inside, her phone buzzed nonstop. Texts, emails, news alerts. but she let it all wait. Tonight wasn't for noise. Tonight was the first time she could hear her own breath. The next morning she returned to the courthouse. On paper, everything was still business as usual. But every glance told a different story. The robe was still there, but she didn't rush to put it on. The looks that followed her were no longer skeptical or dismissive. They were recognizing her. When she stepped into the private elevator reserved for judges, the janitor gave her a nod and placed a hand over his heart. A silent, proud gesture. A young security officer gave her a quick thumbs up, then immediately turned away, blushing. And she entered the courtroom, a routine civil hearing, no high-profile litigants. The entire room stood before the clerk could even make the announcement. That had never happened before. She offered a single nod and took her seat. The law carried on. Case files still stacked high. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in the rules, but in the room itself. Justice now had a new face, and that face wasn't apologizing for taking up space. Celeste walked through the halls, not loudly, not forcefully, but fully, like someone who had spent years shrinking herself and now remembered what it meant to stand tall. The cameras still came. She turned down some interviews, kept reading most of the headlines, but one caught her eye, taped to the break room fridge. Federal judge refuses to back down after public assault. Sparks historic reform from the bench. Someone had written underneath in marker, "That's our judge," and that made her smile. She'd never set out to become a symbol. She just wanted to do her job. But by standing firm, she had empowered others to stand too. Months passed. The courtroom once filled with silence and fear now held something else. Not perfection, but peace, a presence, a grounded, enduring, honest kind of stillness. Not the silence of being silenced, but the silence of being heard, of being seen, of finally living as one's full self. It was the kind of silence that only exists when people know their voices will be heard. The Monroe Doctrine first circulated inside the courthouse, then spread across the region. Other judges began to adopt it. Other cities started calling for details. A bill was being drafted in Congress. Celeste had never planned any of it. But then again, most of what had happened wasn't part of any plan. She had simply refused to back down. And sometimes, and that's all it takes to shift the current, she kept doing the work, day by day. Civil cases, custody hearings, tax disputes. But behind every ruling now lived a deeper awareness. Not just, what does the law say? But who has the law forgotten? One afternoon, Celeste visited a middle school classroom. The teacher had invited her to speak about justice and courage. She thought there'd be 10 kids and a few empty chairs. But the room was full. It followed the trial. Read the articles. Some had written essays. Others made posters. One was taped to the whiteboard with duct tape. Live like Judge Monroe. He didn't talk much, and she didn't need to. The kids asked real questions. How did you stay calm when you knew people hated you? What did it feel like when they cut your hair? Did you ever want to give up? She answered all of them honestly without flinching. But one question stayed with her, from a soft-spoken girl in the back. Do you still believe in the system? Celeste paused for a long moment and replied, I don't believe in the system that was, but I believe in what it can become. And I believe in people like you, still brave enough to ask that question. That will change everything. When she left the school for the first time in months, Celeste cried in her car, not from pain, but from hope. Not long after, the White House called, not for a quote, not for a quick soundbite, but for something bigger. Celeste Monroe had been chosen to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. The ceremony would be televised, the speech already drafted. Officials from across the nation would attend. But for Celeste, what mattered most wasn't who sat in the front row of the platform. It was who would be sitting in the first row of the audience. Nain, her sister, the court clerk, former intern Megan, now a first-year law student, Reverend Hill. And in the far corner, almost hidden among rows of suits, sat the quiet girl from the classroom. The one who had asked the most important question. The stage was a set of white marble steps leading up to the podium. The president stood off to the side. As Celeste stepped forward, the applause rose like a wave. But she didn't raise a hand. She didn't wave. She simply walked to the microphone and began. I was never expected to be here. The room fell silent. Not because I wasn't capable, not because I wasn't worthy, but because for most of my life, systems like this were never built for people like me. She looked out at the crowd, and when I finally made it into the spaces I had worked my entire life to reach, I was still reminded daily that I didn't belong there. She took a long breath, but I stayed. I stood, and I made them see me. She paused for a beat. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I was lucky enough to survive a moment that should have broken me, and because I know too many others didn't. A flash of light flickered from somewhere in the crowd. A camera shutter clicked softly. Celeste scanned the room, then said quietly, "This medal is not just for me. It belongs to every woman who was ever told to stay silent. To every man who was taught that justice wasn't made for them. To every child who looks at the law and sees only fear. This is for you." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous or loud. It was something deeper, reverent, like someone had just understood something for the very first time. The ceremony ended. Celeste stepped down from the stage, and in a state prison across the border, Hank Riker sat alone in his cell, watching the broadcast on a small wall-mounted television. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at the woman he had once tried to destroy, now honored by a nation for the very resilience he had tried to erase. The screen faded to black after the credits rolled, but the silence in the room remained, not a silence of punishment, but one of truth. And truth, in the end, was the one thing he could never silence. What had happened in that courtroom wasn't just the story of a woman or a trial. It was the story of dignity, as truth, as what happens when someone finally says enough. Celeste Monroe was no longer just a bearer of the law. She had become the line. She reminded us that justice is not only about punishment, but about responsibility, about the strength to rise after being stripped bare, about the courage to speak when silence would be easier, about leading with integrity, even when the system has turned its back on you. For those who've lived long enough to witness both change and resistance, this story cuts deeper, because they know real change is slow, is costly, and it requires courage from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Maybe you've been through something like this. Maybe you've seen someone you love face injustice. Maybe you've felt helpless in the face of a system too big to touch. But this story proves power doesn't come from a badge or a title or a seat on the bench. It comes from standing tall when the world tells you to shrink. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or heard, or reminded you that change is still possible, please don't keep it to yourself. Share this video. Send it to someone who needs hope. Subscribe to our channel so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories that challenge, inspire, and tell the truth with everything we've got. Because justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins with us. Right here, right now.